Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. There has been some shockingly bad advice passed along from gardener to gardener over time about how to take care of roses. Let me give you an example of this. Sometimes people are told that they can use dish soap, mixed at something like a teaspoon or a tablespoon per liter of water to wipe out the aphids or spider mites or whatever is ailing their roses. Then they later come to me with pictures of scalded roses, big brown patches on the leaves. It's a chemical burn. The thing is, dish soap is not soap at all. It's a detergent, and it wipes out the protective cuticle layer on the outside of the skin of the roses, and that's what causes that chemical burn. Today I want to go through a number of rose growing, let's say call them folklore. Some of them are flat out myths. So I'm going to go through them one by one. If you want to go down into the description of the video, you'll find an index there of the ones I'm talking about in case you want to get to the myth that concerns you the fastest. All right, let's go. You know, probably the most common one that I've heard, both from gardening clubs, rose societies, and from individuals online, is that you should use Epsom salts on your roses on a routine basis, a quarter cup, a half a cup at time of planting, and then every season thereafter to boost the magnesium levels on your roses. The problem is that this has some truth to it. If your rose was deficient in magnesium, magnesium supplementation can help, but how do you know? Thing is, a lot of garden soils are not deficient in magnesium, including a lot of the soils here in the Fraser Valley where I live, and adding magnesium can disrupt the uptake of potassium and calcium. So unless you know, you're unwise to throw a bunch of extra magnesium into the soil. In fact, there are people who deal with excess magnesium in their soil already in some clay soils. Not a good idea unless you know what you're doing, and the fact that it has worked sometimes, that just confuses the issue in the eyes of the hobbyists. Another one I've heard from time to time, and I could probably blame my grandmother for this one, she taught me that you can take rusty nails and other iron objects and put them out in the garden and bury them at the roots of your plants, supposedly because that can be a source of iron for your plants. Not so. Iron oxide is not taken up well by your plants. It's usually supplied in chelated forms by professionals when it is necessary. So that's just something that is going to increase your risk of puncture wounds, bacterial infections, and I hope you have a tetanus shot. Don't leave rusty nails in the soil underneath your roses. One internet trend of advice I've seen is save your banana peels. Apply them either directly to the base of your roses or make a little potion out of it by composting it in water. The thing about this is that banana peels are high in potassium, but so are many other fruit and vegetable peels. This is why people compost. The fact that you're saving the banana peels separately and applying them has no special purpose. Put it in with your coffee grounds, put it in with your apple peels, your potato peels, any other kitchen compost. Compost it first, it will be less messy. While we're talking about fertilizer for roses, let's talk about the myth that says that more phosphorus will give you larger and more flowers on your roses. Now, when we're talking about N, P, and K, you see on the front of a fertilizer package, it's N first, P is phosphorus, and then K on the end. And what you'll see on many rose fertilizers is that they spike that phosphorus level, have low N, low K, and high phosphorus, when it really is, in terms of what your plants use, exactly the opposite. They need more nitrogen, they need more potassium, they don't need as much phosphorus. I can see where this myth came from, because on a soil that is truly very deficient in phosphorus, you would have poor rooting and you would have poor flowering. The thing is, you don't need a whole ton to correct that deficiency. So I can see that the first person who took a phosphorus deficient soil and added a little bit of phosphorus got great boosts to their flowering. Therefore, anecdotal evidence that gets passed along. But your roses need far less of the phosphorus, and the problem is that because the fertilizer companies have been putting it in at high levels for a number of years, it's building up in people's soils to the level that the plants can't even use and gets to the point of harmful. So no, you don't want to go for too much phosphorus. If anything, it should be lower than your nitrogen and your potassium. The next one I'd like to address is the strong case that some people make for alfalfa tea as a fertilizer for roses. Now, there is no doubt that alfalfa itself as a meal or a pellet is a good food for roses. I apply it myself frequently. It matches their nutrient profile quite nicely with a higher level of nitrogen and lower levels of other nutrients that they need. The problem with turning it into a tea is that it's a lot of extra work, and sometimes you see these concoctions that they put together. It's a big sludgy thing they put into a barrel, stink up the neighborhood for weeks and weeks, trying to achieve this kind of magic potion status of this alfalfa by putting in things like kelp or bat guano or other ingredients and then fermenting it. The problem with adding a whole bunch of microorganisms like that in an uncontrolled environment is you don't know what you're going to get. There's really little proven evidence that this is going to help your garden, and it is going to piss off your neighbors. So I would say if you want to apply the alfalfa directly, the rain or your irrigation will turn it into a tea and break it down in the soil for your roses, and then you get the soil improvement that comes with the whole pellet. Next one I'm going to tackle is vitamin B solutions, sometimes sold under the name Super Thrive. And if I could blame the rusty nails on my grandmother, I can blame the Super Thrive on my grandfather, because that's what he would have in the tool shed, and he would soak his roses in it, saying that it reduced stress in the roses. And this is how it's kind of marketed. The problem is that even though the product has been on the market for like 80 years, they've never produced a shred of evidence that it actually works. And in fact, horticultural experts do not believe that it does. Exogenous applications of vitamin B doesn't seem to reduce stress in plants at all. So this is one of those cases where there's lots of anecdotal evidence that props up an older product that they say and swear by that it's doing good things, and I don't want to dispute that. I mean, personal experience is personal experience, but the scientific evidence doesn't bear it out. Here's one I hear pretty frequently: synthetic fertilizers or chemical fertilizers are bad for your plants. Well, this one isn't quite as straightforward as you might think. It's not as a matter of good or bad versus organic or synthetic. Your plants actually can't tell the difference. For the entire list of nutrients, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, iron, all the way down the line, your roses can't tell where that nutrient ion came from. But what can happen is that organic fertilizers do something additional while they're there. So if you added organic compost or manure or alfalfa to your soil, you're actually improving the soil structure as the organisms break it down, whereas your chemical fertilizers don't do any of that work. So it's not a matter of good or bad, it's a matter of appropriate for your situation and personal choice, because some people have made the commitment to organic fertilizers, which I respect the heck out of, but it doesn't mean that synthetics are necessarily bad. Now let's talk a little bit about those things that people will spray onto their roses to try to cure diseases or get rid of insects. We've already talked about dish soap, which is a very clear-cut case of that is not good for your plants. But what about some of the other with more mixed results? Something like, let's say, milk spray, trying to combat either powdery mildew or black spot on your roses. Because I just did a video on black spot, this did come up. Now there is no evidence that supports its use for black spot. It's just not out there. And this doesn't mean I'm dismissing your personal experience. It just means that there just isn't enough scientific research that backs the use of this. Where there is research in pretty extensive amounts is on powdery mildew, where they kind of figure if you used it in a greenhouse situation and you got it before the strong establishment of powdery mildew, that it has a good chance. They've tested it on cucumbers and other crops that are susceptible to powdery mildew, and so there is some backup for that use of milk spray, but on black spot it just isn't there. Another one that I've heard a lot about is neem oil. Now I have to admit that my own personal experience with the neem oil has been less than thrilling. It's very slow, and honestly it is not even in the best of the research going to take care of an insect or a disease problem that is already established. It may have some effect on soft-bodied insects, but it's going to do nothing for things like beetles or other hard-bodied insects. And in terms of the spores on either powdery mildew or black spot, again, not once it's established, only if you spray it as a preventive, which I'm not dismissing that approach at all. Also, sulfur is good, sprayed as a preventive. Potassium bicarbonate is pretty reasonable, but none of these are a cure-all, especially on diseases or pests that are already established on the plants. So if I'm saying that some of these more natural solutions, things like sulfur or neem or potassium bicarbonate or milk, aren't strong enough to deal with an existing infestation or disease on your plants, then what about the harder stuff? What about the synthetic pesticides? And some people swear by this. They kind of figure you can't grow roses without the synthetic fungicides and pesticides. The thing about those is that most populations of pests and disease, particularly fungus-based diseases like black spot and powdery mildew, will adapt to the use of these synthetic chemicals fairly quickly in real field situations. I used them for a long time in the industry and found that we had to rotate between a number of different chemicals to try to get satisfactory control, and it got harder over time. So Personally, I don't favor the use of synthetic pesticides. I won't judge you if you do use them, especially if you get good results with them, but just understand that there are resistance issues that crop up after extended use. So my general approach on a lot of these is to go with biological diversity in the garden to wipe out the insect populations. They all have natural enemies, and then a lot of them are present right here in your gardens. And when it comes to fungal diseases on plants, if it gets out of hand, I prune back and try to bring it back clean. And at that point, the preventive sprays are more useful. The next bit of folk advice I'd like to address is that you must soak your bare root roses before you plant them at the time of planting. Now, the thing with this is that if the bare roots have been in storage and transport and come to you and they're looking a little bit dry, then soaking them may help a little bit. If you make it a short soak, it can be as little as 2 to 4 hours, as much as say overnight or 24 hours. The thing is, I'm hearing this advice given in a very blanket way, and the fact is that you can do it. It's probably not going to do any harm, but it might not do any help either, as if the roses are already, or the roots are already well hydrated. Did a video this spring where I showed you my bare root roses as they arrived, very plump, very firm, and lots of moisture in those. It just went directly into the ground and did just fine. So it's not one of those things that's right or wrong, but situationally, if you find that the roots are dry, giving them a quick soak probably won't do any harm. Another bit of planting advice you'll get is that at the time of planting, this is when you should be adding a scoop of bone meal to the planting hole. Now, while this is often posed as optional, my point would be that we really don't need to boost the phosphorus levels for reasons I've already mentioned earlier in the video, and that's what primarily you're going to be adding with bone meal. Speaking of planting time, a couple of other things that I hear. One, from rose experts saying that you must place the crown of that plant well below soil level and indeed cover up the base of all of the lower stems. This is a measure that can make sense for colder climate planting, but it is one of those things you shouldn't be too emphatic about. It should be a thing of what works in your own climate. Here, in a fairly mild climate, I have had great success, very little loss, by planting that crown right at soil level. And what it does is it gives me access to inspect the crown, which is a spot on the rose that is more vulnerable to damage, and also if there is a graft union on there, that way I can keep an eye on when rootstock suckers are coming, so I can see whether they came from below the graft union or above the graft union. So that's my reasoning for it, but it isn't something you have to be super emphatic about. Second thing that I hear a lot is people talking about planting a big hole, digging a big hole, and filling it with lots of compost, lots of manure, lots of other amendments at the time of planting. And this is really not great for plant establishment. They really do need to establish for anchoring into your native soil, and you can always amend later. So this is the key point that people are missing, is that amendments can always be added to the top of the soil. You can always feed from the top of the soil, but what you can't do after the fact is reestablish the structure of that planting hole. If you filled it with a bunch of organic amendments that will later sink down or compress over time, and the roots don't go beyond the hole itself, you won't get a second chance to fix that, and the plant may be weak at the neck all the way through its early establishment. The final group of rose growing myths that I'm going to talk about have to do with pruning your roses. I do discuss these separately in my 7 rules video, but it bears repeating here because this is a video on rose growing myths. The first one is this fussy advice about that you should cut the roses at a 45-degree angle, that you should cut them above an outward facing bud, and that you should go around afterwards and seal all the pruning cuts. All of these are horticulturally questionable at the least. The angle of the cut, 45 degrees, it is far more important just to cut at a natural angle for your hand and get a clean cut, and marginally speaking, the literature favors a smaller surface area rather than the larger surface area that's created by that 45-degree angle. The second part there, cutting above a node or a bud outward facing, your roses aren't going to obey you in this regard anyway. They're not going to grow just from that bud. They're going to grow from many buds down the stem and pick their own adventure and shape and direction, so you don't have to try to fuss around that. And the third thing, the pruning of sealing cuts, well, typically at the time that you are sealing your roses at that time of year, the flying insects that they blame on cane borers or cane damage aren't really out and about in the landscape anyway, and the ones that are the most damaging do not enter through the cut ends of those stems. They enter through just live tissue near the tips and burrow their way down. So I pretty much put all of this advice in the category of makes the job more complicated than it needs to be when beginners are learning how to do the hobby. So I avoid them, I avoid giving that advice, and you don't need to worry about them. All right, that's all I have for you today on rose growing myths. I'm sure I've missed some. Drop those down into the comments below the video and we'll see if we can clear them up together.